guest. All right, I've been eagerly awaiting this moment. It is my pleasure to introduce business anchor and journalist Maggie Lake, who will lead a discussion with Paul Pullman on how courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take. Maggie, take it away.
Thank you, Tolu, and thank you, Paul Pullman, for making time for this conversation. You know, you're one of those rare people who fits the description of someone who doesn't really need an introduction, but for the benefit of our global online audience, I'd like to give a little bit of background. You are the former CEO of Unilever, where you really proved the value of sustainability leadership. You're also SDG advocate, the co-vice chair of the UN Global Compact Board, the co-founder and chair of Imagine, and now also the co-author of the forthcoming book, Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time out of that very busy schedule to spend it with us today.
It's an honor. Thank you, Maggie.
So many in our audience will, of course, be familiar with your work at Unilever, but bring us up to date on some of the other initiatives that you're working on, including, of course, the decision to co-author the book.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned some of it. I've never believed in retiring. It sounded like you were tired before and you're tired again. So that was never appealing to me. I think there's enough to do to put yourself to the service of people and planet. We've seen it in the previous panels on the humanitarian crisis, the climate crisis, etc. So I like to focus on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals by all means possible, and focus especially on climate change and inequality. So I get involved in the COP26 or in the G7, G20, with working with some of the governments in the SDG advocate function that I hold, and some of the other things. The main thing I focus on is really how we can accelerate the systems change to drive these things forward at a more consistent level. At the leadership level, which is very important, you don't have any systems change without personal change, but also at the broader company level. At the leadership level, I chair the Side Business School. I'm on the board of Prime, on some of the youth networks, which are incredibly powerful, One Young World, Nexus, and all the other things. And at the systems level, I created Imagine. What is very clear is that most of the CEOs know where they need to go. The science is clear, the direction is clear, but they also understand that we're not going at the speed and scale that is needed. And this is what we're trying to address, at least partially, with Imagine. The theory of change of Imagine is very simple. If you bring a critical mass of CEOs together by industry sector across the value chain, you can actually create tipping points. We look at the industries that are the most devastating for the Sustainable Development Goals. Industries like fashion, tourist and travel, food, and the whole way we produce food in this world. We bring the CEOs together. And what we see is that when these CEOs come together, they not only collectively become more courageous and willing to set higher targets, but we can also overcome some of the inherent obstructions that are built in our current system that prevents us from driving the systems changes. What we see is when you have the 20-25% of the CEOs together, civil society wants to join, others come in, governments start to listen, and we drive the broader framework changes that are needed. The example on food would be moving to regenerative agriculture, helping the important UN Food System Summit that is currently going on. In fashion, we're trying to implement with 80 companies the Paris agreements and stay below 1.5 degrees, put biodiversity inside of their business models, moving to generative cotton, getting out of single-use plastics. These are the type of initiatives. And then indeed, I found some time to write a book, which we call Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. And that is based on my firm belief, which I've always had, that companies should profit not from creating the world's problems, but from solving them. And that is what we are addressing in that book. And I hope it is useful to many of them who will be reading it.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit, because I think that we know that many companies are working to be less bad, if we can put it that way, right? Reduce the impact they're creating. I mean, it's their consumers and their customers are demanding it, really. But your vision of the future of this net positive sort of leans a different way. Tell us a little bit more about that. How is it different?
Well, the simple thing, Maggie, is to say that World Overshoot Day this year was July 29th, which is actually the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish. In other words, every day after that, we're actually stealing from future generations. You've seen COVID as a direct consequence of the destruction of our natural habitat. We are far exceeding the capacity of Mother Earth to regenerate itself, and we're paying dear consequences for that. Business understands that and sees the enormous opportunity to address this. We did a study with the Business and Sustainable Development Commission looking just at the Sustainable Development Goals, and we found in the next 10 years an opportunity of $12 trillion and creating 380 million more jobs. Far better than what we pay for our costs of failures, as the tragic COVID has shown us here. So what this is about is about bringing companies to a level of positive contribution to this world, playing to win, playing for the things that are really needed, and not anything less anymore. We simply can't afford that. So what I try to do, just as Imagine is a social movement, I also created with the book a not-for-profit social movement where net positive hopefully becomes the standard, where people say, I want to work for a net positive company, I want to go to a net positive university, etc. A net positive company takes responsibility of its total impact in society, not only scope 1 or 2. A net positive company optimizes the return of all stakeholders, not myopically focused on the shareholder. A net positive company is involved in the broader transformation that is needed in society. And these are obviously things that are difficult to achieve, and the book helps you with that. It also calls out some of the tougher choices, how to deal with tax, corruption, trade associations that say different things, human rights in the value chain. So we don't mince words, we use our experience, and hopefully it galvanizes the leaders that we need today and tomorrow into that higher level of action. I call it, Maggie, moving from CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is basically being less bad, which is simply not good enough anymore, to RSC, become a responsible social corporation. And if COVID has shown us one thing, is that many people think there's a trade-off between ESG and shareholder primacy, or there's a trade-off between purpose and non-purpose driven companies. It could not be farther from the truth anymore. I think the evidence is coming in day after day that more purposeful companies that operate under a long-term multi-stakeholder model actually increasingly also are not only more resilient, but also have a higher return eventually for the shareholders itself.
Absolutely. We're entering a period, and I think it's so important to not talk about it just in terms of cost, but really the value that's created, right? And the opportunity around this, which you're right, I think the evidence is building up on, and to provide a pragmatic framework for how to get there, which is so important because I think the desire and intent is there. What is your advice or the one lesson you would have for business leaders?
Well, if I may come back to that framework that you mentioned, Maggie, because that is so important. In fact, the Sustainable Development Goals that were approved by 193 countries in 2015 is in fact that framework to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable way. In the absence of the global institutions functioning, globalization working the way we had envisioned it, multilateralism not functioning, in fact, the Sustainable Development Goals are our own moral framework. And I'm glad that the UN Global Compact has really embedded that in everything it does. And it's not surprising that you see its membership growing. We now have 14,000 members, and nearly 75% of the CEOs say that they will accelerate action with the Sustainable Development Goals. My two simple messages are very simply, there's no systems change, as I mentioned, without organizational change, and no organizational change without individual change. This is as much a leadership transformation. So we need courageous leaders. Courage comes from the French word cœur, which is as much the heart as it is the brain. Leaders with apathy, with humility, humanity, that can work in these partnerships, have a strong purpose, think multi-generational. So become one of those leaders. It's not easy, but that's the only thing I think that can keep your true north and make you take courageous decisions. And then the second thing is what you're referring to. This is just an enormous opportunity in front of us. We're well beyond the point that the cost of inaction is exceeding the cost of action. It is now much cheaper, hence a bigger opportunity to do something about it and embed sustainability smack in the middle of your business plans. You only get one chance. You're so much better off for it as a business and as an individual. And I think you want to be on the right side of history. The train has frankly left the stations. The smart CEOs understand that they are on board, and you certainly don't want to miss it. And the book Net Positive will help you be on the train and be successfully on the train.
And Paul, we thank you for leading by example and leading the way for the next generation of leaders. We could obviously keep this conversation going for hours. That's all we have time for right now. But we look forward to learning more about the concept of net positive. I hope that becomes embedded in the framework and the language we're all using now. The publication of your book out next month, first week of October, rather, and available for pre-order right now. Thank you for joining us today here at UN Global Compact Private Sector Forum. Paul Pullman, thanks so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Be safe. Thank you.
Well, I am definitely getting that book. Paul, it is wonderful to see you again. And thank you, Maggie, for that enlightening conversation.